This is the International AQA certificate for GCSE, and the topic is the nervous system. What you can see on the screen here is your green sheet, the topics from the objectives from your folder and the specification, specifically modified for those doing double award, dual award system. For those doing the triple award, there is the extra element that covers the brain that's important to look at. Looking at the nervous system, it's all about communication around the body, and it's very important, therefore, that organisms are able to respond to changes in their environment around them in order and ensure their survival. It is therefore very important that we understand what some of these responses might actually be. In any exam question, you could quite feasibly be asked to pick out from any situation what is the receptor, what is the stimulus, what is the response, and so on and so forth. So to pick up some examples, we can look at some types of receptor. And on the receptors, we know that our light is detected by our eyes, so light being the stimulus and the eyes being the receptor. Similarly, the ears picking up sound, and so on and so forth. So taste receptors in the tongue, small receptors in the nose for the smell, and on the skin we have receptors for temperature, pressure, touch, all those sorts of things all mixed in together. Therefore, there's a distinct pathway that must be followed for any impulse, and that starts with the stimulus being one of these, light, sound, etc., etc. That stimulus detected by the receptor, again the eyes, the ears, or whatever it may be. That stimulus, that message, is therefore at the receptor transformed from whatever form of energy it is in. For example, light energy is received. It's then transformed or transduced, if you're thinking of physics, into an electrical impulse. After being transformed into an electrical impulse, that impulse and the message is carried to the coordinator. And we'll look at this in more detail, but those coordinators can either be the brain or the spinal cord. There, the message is relayed from one neuron to the next, where it's ultimately passed to the effector organ. And if we go back to our example, for example, sound, picked up by the ears, processed in the brain, a response to an effector organ may well be a muscle to enable you to move or to cover your ears or whatever it may be. That movement, the action that's resultant from your stimulus, is ultimately called your response. So, all of these are conscious actions. There's a whole range of different conscious actions that it may be. So we've talked about detecting things on your skin. That is then carried around your body using sensory neurons. And sensory neurons are connected to your receptors, which pick up this stimulus. That sensory neuron is connected onto your spinal cord. Misspelling of cord. From there it goes up to the brain. Conscious actions must go to the brain because there are higher order of processing is required. From there, the brain has to decide what to do with it, maybe move the hand, whatever it may be. And finally, move this out of the way. An impulse must be sent off to the motor neuron, whereby the response can be carried out, such as movement. The key thing is to make sure you have the complete pathway from stimulus through the right neurons, the sensory neurons, through the processing unit, the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord, connecting to the motor neuron via a relay neuron, which again we'll look at in a moment, to ultimately bring out your response, which is, in this case, movement. Here is that pathway written out. Stimulus receptor through a sensory neuron, onto the coordinator, the motor neuron onto your effector, a muscle for example, bringing about your response. That pathway you really need to be able to describe in detail, giving examples of any particular situation. To carry out those messages to be sent from one place to another, there are a range of different nerve cells. This is a typical nerve cell. It's a very specialised form of a cell. It has a cell body, it has a nucleus, it has cytoplasm just like any other cell, the cell membrane, but as you can see, it's very unique in its shape. Here's the nucleus, the cell body, and at the far end, the attachments onto muscle strands, and these red lines are your muscle fibres. So a nerve cell is also known as a neuron, and it's basically an elongated cell, making it much, much longer. And this particular one connects onto a muscle. There are three main types. Those that cause movement, motor skills, are called motor neurons. Those that do the detecting are sensory neurons, because they do sensing. And those that connect the two together, only ever found in the CNS, brain and spinal cord, are relay neurons. Now, so far we've discussed a lot of conscious actions. The main reason bodies need to be able to respond to their environment around them is for protection. Against maybe a predator, maybe against drying out in the sun or the heat, all sorts of different reasons. These responses must be reflex actions, and reflex responses are unconscious. They do not require thought, and therefore they do not require lots of processing in the brain. So, for example, here's a child about to stick a fork into a plug. They need to know to avoid doing so. This is the reflex arc, the action pathway. It's very important for you to know it, to be able to label one of these and describe exactly what happens at each position. So what we've got here, we've got a hand drawn at the bottom, which would obviously have muscles in it through your arms. These lines are your neurons, the nerve fibres, travelling all the way up would ultimately connect into this structure, which is your section through your spinal cord. And it's not your vertebrae, the bones, it's the actual spinal cord itself, which is a big bundle of neurons and nerve fibres. And what we can see, there are two parts to the central nervous system, and specifically the spinal cord. We have the grey matter, and we have the white matter. The grey matter is where all the cell bodies are found of your neurons and the actual bits with the nucleus. There is one cell body. Whereas the white matter is usually where the nerve fibres are found. As we've looked at the pathway already of the reflex, the same principle applies here. A sensory neuron carries the impulse from the receptor in the hand all the way up into the spinal cord as part of the central nervous system. From there, it joins onto a very short neuron, which was, as you'll recall, the relay neuron. So here is your sensory neuron, here is your relay neuron. Here it is. Still within the central nervous system, it connects onto the motor neuron. And that is if it's moving to muscle. If it was not going to a muscle and not causing movement, it wouldn't be called a motor, it would be called an effector neuron. That might go to somewhere like a gland, where hormones would be released. So the impulse is continuing round this loop, sensory, onto the relay, onto the motor neuron, which travels back out of the spinal cord, down attaching onto the muscle. And that muscle would then bring about the response, which would be to contract to cause movement. You need to be able to label this diagram completely. You need to be able to put on the direction through which the impulse travels up the sensory neuron into the central nervous system, round the relay neuron, and then back down the motor or effector neuron onto the muscle. That is your reflex arc for unconscious reactions that you don't need to think about and are therefore usually protective for the body. That impulse, the message, is in an electrical form. It started off as maybe touch, pressure or heat at the receptor, and it turned into an electrical form. That electrical form needs to, we understand how we get across from one neuron to the next, because as we know, electricity cannot jump gaps. That gap, the joining between one neuron and the next, so the sensory to relay neuron, or relay onto motor neuron, is called a synapse. And here's what happens at the synapse. Here's one nerve fibre coming in and finishing. Here's the beginning of the next nerve fibre. You've got neuron A and neuron B. This bit here, the gap between the two, is your synapse. So it's literally a space between the two. And the way the electricity, that message, gets across is it transforms from being electrical into a chemical message. And that chemical message is a chemical neurotransmitter. And that's a crucial term for you to know how to use and spell. There's a chemical neurotransmitter is released from the end of the first neuron, and it moves into the space, the gap, and travels across the gap onto receptors waiting for it on the next neuron. Because there is a high concentration of neurotransmitter on this side of the gap and a low concentration on the other side of the gap, we therefore set up a diffusion gradient going from high to low concentration. So therefore we must describe that the neurotransmitter diffuses across the gap. When enough neurotransmitter has reached this side, then a new electrical impulse can be generated, and so the message can continue from the sensory onto the relay, or from the relay onto the neuron, the motor neuron. So it's crucial terms on neurotransmitter diffusing across the gap to form an electrical impulse to be regenerated on the other side of the synapse.